Sorry, had to record. Tonight's presentation is a poetry reading by Maine Poet Laureate Julia Bouwsma. Before we begin, we ask that you please have your camera off and your microphone muted. There will be a question and answer session at the end where you can simply type your question into the chat box at any time during this. I'll keep track of them. And we also want to make you aware that the presentation is being recorded. For those of you that are not familiar with the Rufus Porter Museum, we were founded in 2005, and our mission is to celebrate the life, times, and legacy of a remarkable 19th century New Englander through preservation and promotion of creativity and invention. Rufus Porter is well recognized in the folk art world for his murals. However, he was so much more than an artist. He was a musician, a teacher, an inventor, and the founder of the Scientific American magazine, which is still in publication today. I should add that he was also a poet and included poems in the early versions of the Scientific American. Our museum campus is home to two historic houses, the circa 1840 John and Marcia Webb House and the circa 1790 Nathan Church House, which is one of Bridgeton's oldest surviving buildings and the original headquarters of the museum. We offer permanent and special exhibits, events, classes, lectures, and other educational opportunities that further our mission. Our season is open mid-June to mid-October, and in our off-season, we're open by appointment. To learn more about us, please visit our website at rufusportermuseum.org. And you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. If you are unable to visit us in person, we do offer an online tour on our website, as well as virtual access to our museum collection. I would like to present our speaker for the evening, Julia Bouwsma. Julia lives off the grid in the mountains of Western Maine, where she is a poet, a homesteader, an editor, a teacher, a small town librarian, and Maine's current poet laureate. Julia is also the author of two poetry collections, Midden and Work by Bloodlight, both of which received Maine Literary Awards for poetry. We also carry Midden in our gift store. Julia currently serves as the library director for Webster Library in Kingfield, Maine, and teaches intermittently in the creative writing department at the University of Maine at Farmington. Julia will now be presenting a reading of new and published poems, and we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. It's all you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Madeline. It's a delight to be here tonight with you all to read some poems to you. So I thought what I decided I would do tonight is I'm going to begin and end with poems that I have written that are public poems that I've written as Poet Laureate. And then in between, I'm going to read you a couple poems from my first book, a couple poems from my second book, Midden, and a little bit of new work. So this first poem is a poem that I was asked to write. This was actually basically my first assignment once I was selected as Poet Laureate. And so I wrote this. I was asked to write a poem for the bicentennial time capsule. And our outgoing Poet Laureate had already written a poem. They were a year late with the time capsule because of the pandemic. So there was time to include a poem by me as well. And they asked me to write a poem with an eye toward the future and who might be opening it in the future, which felt like a tall order, but it was an exciting challenge. And this is what came out. And one reason that I should say too, one reason that I wanted to read this poem tonight is that it is an epistolary poem, which means it's a poem that is also a letter. And I wanted to read it tonight because when we do the Q&A, I'd love a chance to talk a little bit to you about a new program that we're launching as a pilot project this spring, which is an epistolary poetry project. We're going to have 5 workshops in the state of free workshops in April in different locations in Maine and 2 online. And people can sign up and practice and learn about writing epistolary poetry. And then afterward, there'll be an opportunity for people to be paired up as poetry pen pals and to write some poems back, letter poems back and forth to one another. So I've been really excited about the epistolary form, and I thought I would open tonight's reading with that poem. So this poem is called To a Mainer Living 100 Years from Now. The other day I stood beneath an ash tree as old as the time between my writing this letter and you reading it. Inside the green moment of the forest, I traced my finger across the ash's trunk. Grooved bark staggered like vertebrae. A deer bent back to listen, quiet flanks reddening the stillness before crouch became bolt, and it leapt into a lattice of blackberry cane and brush. Tell me, unknown friend, what has dissipated from our home and what remains? Does it still snow hard enough to swallow your footsteps in light? Do you drink sap each spring, boil your sorrow into new waft and gold? We lived here at the edge of the old rituals, lived there until we could not discern our hope from our fear. Wildfire smoke smeared a low brow of bruise, a language written in billowing keloids and contrails, vanishing welts of vapor. Are you still repeating our same old violences, or have you learned new ones? Can you wring a chicken's neck with your hands, twist and pull the throat in unison, as my grandmother's grandmother did, and I do now? Or have you colonized Mars, erected skyscrapers of cosmic concrete? Scientists are at it now, discovering a building material of human tears, sweat, urine, blood. It hardens fast and cheap, stronger, they say, than anything we've ever known before. For you, I wish nothing but birdsong. I wish you a pond of peepers screaming spring thaw. And all those apple trees I planted. It's early autumn now, their striated skin seeping blush into white flesh as they ripen. Do they still stand on this hill? Pick one for me, please, if they do. Bite down among stippled wormholes and taste our blinding sweetness. So I'll read you two poems from my first book, Work by Bloodlight. And the first poem that I'm going to read you, I guess it reflects this idea that was in the last poem of our violences, right? Which is a thing as a homesteader, farmer living in the woods, I have occasion to think about fairly often. So this poem is about the time that I shot a weasel out of my hen house. We are just 3 mouths, a rifle on my shoulder. I am in the hen house again. The scream is one pitch too high for human. The weasel is a white scarf at her throat, pas de deux of feather and fur I watch through my gun sight. Empty metal eye inches from its collar of snow, blast that shatters any dance. The weasel falls back, starts to rise as if it were easy, one motion, no difference between the hen's blood in its mouth and the red hole spreading its ribs. I step on it hard, the flash of black eyes. It claws, bites my boot. We are 3 bodies in soiled pine shavings, 3 mouths. The weasel winces. Eyes close, open, limbs stretch into the last hard act of breath. The second bullet slips, trembling from my hand. I drop the gun hard once, twice, but the weasel's elegant neck won't snap. I find the bullet, reload, press into the pink-white fold of ear, pull. Gunpowder and sawdust, a soft head slap. I reach down to grasp what I have done. I lift it by the tail. And I'll read you the last poem in this book too, which is it's really a love poem. For my partner in our land. Land and body. Here, we have survived another year. Take this bounty, our love, the resistance we feel between our teeth as seeds crack and extend their pale finger selves into paper towel, then earth. Buried alive so they may grow into green billowing, we will eat as a new promise, saute in garlic, olive oil, feed to one another as if to say, there is no distance between taking and giving. A ritual of regret carried out beside the deer head on the porch, its skin flaked to sodden leather, dark as leaf mulch. My hands have traced the pale trifold stitching of skull, and I have been in mud today. I have cleaned up shit, clotted through boxes of frozen chicken, leg after leg split and stacked like cordwood into the box, splintered bone, flesh skinned pink, a cold meat. And your hands have set the cinder blocks for a woodshed, have split the kindling, have dug the grave for the dog who lies rotting against ledge rock 4 feet down in a frost heave, waiting until the irises spread up over his brindled, poisoned bloom, his cancer-chewed paw, his canine shining white as the moon that slips naked to run against our snow-spread lawn as we stand in front of the door, your arms folding me into you until I feel it, our hardness, the bicep and bruise of all the sap buckets we have lifted and poured, every bag of grain hauled, bale of hay thrown, animals we have mended and killed, tasted, tricked to the slaughter, every potato forked from the ground, each nail pounded, the boards above and below us, how all of it binds us, grafts us one into the other, our freshly harrowed skin. So I'll read a couple of poems from my book, Midden. And I want to introduce this book by way of just making sure that everyone knows what this is about. So this book is about the Malaga Island eviction and erasure. So in case you don't know, in 1912, the state of Maine forcibly evicted an interracial community of about 47 people from their home on Malaga Island, which is just off the coast of Phippsburg. And this included ordering everyone to tear down their homes under threat that they would be burned. And people took their own homes down because they needed the materials to rebuild. There was also a school on the island that was dismantled. There were 9 people who were sent by the state to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, including one whole family, the Marks family. And there were 18 graves that were dug up, combined into 5 caskets and reburied unmarked at the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. And then there was about a century of silence that followed before anybody really started to talk about this. So I'm just going to read you a couple of poems from this book. When I first started learning about Malaga, I heard certain stories, and then as I would learn more, I would find out that the stories that I heard weren't necessarily true. This is one of the first poems I wrote for the book. And I wrote it after visiting the island for the first time while the archaeological dig sites, there was some archaeological digs done by the University of Southern Maine, and while those sites were still open. The story of fire. Our brush fires hung thick and black. They kept us warm, cooked our pots of clams, and every day the villagers smelled our smoke from their porches on the mainland. A stick on fire curls and curls, each fiber glows as it peels from the stalk. So it is with a story, driftwood flames green to blue, how they came in boats, how our shacks caught like a shot of light when match met kerosene, how we left in their boats, how we huddled close, how Mama bent to the baby, her crooked arm clamping him silent, how a child curled mouth to smoky knees and bit them to red. A stick on fire. Now, 100 years later, the archaeologists find no ash, no scorched ground, no scraps of charred wood, just loose nails in the shell heap. Evidence that when the villagers said leave, we willingly tore our houses down with our hands. There's a sequence that runs through this book that are letters to ghosts. And these were a place where I really reckoned with what I was doing and thought about it and interrogated myself and wondered, why I was thinking about why I was writing this book, why I was haunted by this story, and whether I had the right to tell it and what it all meant. So this is actually the first of the Dear Ghost poems in the book. Dear Ghosts, I pick the list for names like herringbones from the fish's oiled cavity. I run them between my teeth, stroke the scarred light of photographs. Your granulated faces, mimeographed eyes, always left in the dark. I take up scissors, razor blades, the rusted garden loppers, pinking shears. I scissor you to islands, rearrange until my fingerprints peel your faces gray. I bind you to my walls. I let you hang. You watch me sleep, your silence a bloodburst in my mouth. I dream of ink, wake as a stain against my sheets. Finally, I shred the maps, scatter the portraits, watch you faceless flutter down. 100-year-old snow dusts the ground. This is our only blessing. Bury you in the yard, sing as I fingernail our forgetting into the bone clay. So I'll read you one more poem from this book. This is a little bit longer. It's written in sections. It's called Interview with the Dead. So each section is a question. Who were you then? And instantly the tongue becomes the prism of fracture, land of washed green light, ferns, wild hops, hemlock, lichen skinning the granite outcrops. And instantly the tongue becomes a well, a stone cast into memories falling. When there's no one left to name the helix of departure unfurling inside you, wear silence as a tattered shirt, a stain of torn buttons. We carried it in our spines and anyone could see it when we walked. And instantly the tongue turns to salt, white film and blanch. For not even the tongue can taste what came before salt. How do you remember your island? As stone fingers spread an octave into the sea. As salt brands ankles and red mud heels callous to clay. As dreams in which we still pick blackberries. As brambles scratch a map into our skin, as we thread the fish hook pull the line taut, as a catch of blood in the back of the throat, as fingers tying a knot. How did you leave? Our houses became our bodies. We lashed ourselves to rafts. Our bodies became boats. Some left as cargo in boats, boxes. We wept or did not weep until home became the rubble between our teeth, the thing one cannot bite for fear of breaking. Then we were a people sculpted of wind, and when we left, we scattered as breath, lingered as breath. Then we were a people carved of gravel and dust, and we left as the land stripped from the land, carrying our hearts in our fists. Where did you go? To hallways of sweat and bleach, to white walls and locked doors, to brass bed frames and the endless folding of sheets, to the thin lips of strangers at the market, to back doors of summer mansions, to mud flats and shanty camps, to clusters of islands too tiny to name, to houses rebuilt with the same old boards, but smaller this time, and the windows all in the wrong place. What did you leave behind? Our arms spread out around it all until our hands could not meet our hands. So I'm going to read you a few new poems. These are from an as of still unpublished manuscript of mine, titled Death Fluorescence. And after I wrote Midden, I was thinking a lot about a couple of things. One of the things that I was thinking about a lot was this connection between identity and land, which is something that I've developed so much as a homesteader, and it's become such a huge part of my poetry, and was a really big lens for me in which through which I was considering the Malaga story. But I was also thinking too about how I kind of, I end up saying my land as a sort of shorthand. And, I've thought so much about how, land ownership is such a fallacy, such a violent fallacy. So I wrote this poem thinking about that, thinking about all the violence that has been done to people in the name of ownership. And also this idea that the land, right, it doesn't need us. After we wound the land to maps, better stewardship than ownership, but this wooded hill has never needed anyone. Without us, it stretched its green flanks feral until blackberry canes cracked under their own weight. Deer tramped switchback tunnels through the undergrowth. Columbine erupted purple and pink-white beneath sugar maples. Without us, the hill's scars turned porous. August aster bottle brushed from cellar holes. A stand of ash rose from a single stump. Snakes studded themselves into the splicing silences of the stone walls and slept. Without us, the stories grew moss and sprouted saplings like an erratic boulder from its hulking granite back. And likely, the hill preferred this, for it never needed us here to hear or tell of the seven-sided pole barn filled with its 7 years of trash, of the baby diapers and propane tanks that shot shrapnel when the man before us set it ablaze. Nor did it need the story of the DEA helicopter sent to arrest the man before him, man of shotgun and wild rumors, of holes all over the front lawn where the pot plants grew and where we still now sometimes stumble carrying our buckets. No, the land didn't need the herd of cows before him either, or the family they belonged to, the ones who built this rotting cabin, who dug septic and well, and then one day just up and disappeared. Though that woman came back once in a dusty white minivan, driven by her daughter, who came to see one last time her lost home, and told to me through plastic oxygen tubes from the car window of a time when this whole hillside rolled with wheat, sheep, fields, and the hubris of a farmer who scrambled to gather his hay as thunderclouds bore down upon him. How once the last bale was in, he shook his fist at the sky in triumph, and the sky replied a pitchfork of lightning right into the roof of his barn. So fire, so all those fields regrew to woods, so new scrub for the partridge, so no trace of the now vanished schoolhouse, nothing left of the sawmill but a clogged stone dam and a swamp of dank leaves. Just the headstones remain, mildew and algae on marble, children buried before their parents. Just the rusted gate, the tree-bent chain link, the rest left home at first opportunity, drawn by the heady violence of opportunity, abandoned this hill to a new violence of boundary pins and parceling out. And here I am now, an unwanted steward, unneeded witness. I am here, and this topography has made a debt of me. The debt began before we ever arrived. Perhaps the debt began when someone followed a deer through the woods on the way to the river, or perhaps when the mountains first churned with glacial debris. Certainly, the debt began when someone wrote their name on a property map, a deed. And by the time we arrived, adolescent on the solipsistic romance of our own manifest destiny, believing we could make our own end, glowing from the flickering light of flame-colored leaves, we already knew. The wound was us. It lodged in our throats. It grew under our tongues, moss to a slope, lily of the valley to a grave, until we could no longer discern the green of the hill from the skin of our hands. Each spring weeps its spring runoff, sugars the trees with tears, but the wound remains. The wound festers violet and lilac. It swells a bloat pond of summer warbling. It lacerates a hot fist of fall color with the urgency of an extinction burst. And yet, the land lumbers on, its low dirge of survival and pine pitch stitching us, lichen to lesion, light to ligament, rock to rib. So another thing that I was really thinking about after writing Midden was I was thinking about this idea of inherited trauma. And I was thinking about this idea of inherited silences. There's so many of the descendants of Malaga didn't know that they were descendants of Malaga because families were too ashamed to talk about it and too traumatized to talk about it. And I recognize these kinds of silences in my own family history on my mother's side. On my mother's side, I'm Jewish, and I noticed all of these kinds of silences. So this is a poem about that. It's about sort of how that silence itself is a part of who one is. Point of origin. Discussing the problem of origins with my mother on the telephone again, I watched the frozen lake extend beneath the window panes. A frozen lake recalls blank poster board, as in grade school. Half the family tree wizened white after I came home asking nationalities. countries of origin. And my mother said, just put Jewish. And I said, Jewish is not a country. So she tried to tell me what she knew, which amounted to something like snow falling in a forest that spanned all the way from Austria to Lithuania or Estonia or Russia. A forest marked by sudden uneven clearings called fields where bodies might be found. A dark forest pocked by villages no one wanted to remember the names of, so they forgot them, or in any event forgot to tell their children, as perhaps they forgot even their own names, stilled and severed until it became impossible to trace. One name found on a ship's manifest, another claimed at entry. A stranger inside a familiar, a matryoshka we don't speak of until it's too late. The ones who know dead and gone, the documents scattered and opaque. Now my mother speaks of research, suggests a distant relative who might know more, but like the crusted snow that coats this lake, erasure has become a skin. Inside me, an expanse of ice extends, and below that ice, a fish swims slow and dark, scaling figure eights between the stones. In winter, a lake transforms to field. Between pickup trucks and fishing shacks, a lone figure paces. I cannot see the fish, and yet I know it's there, beneath this makeshift ground. So another thing I've been thinking a lot about is elegy. In these last few years, it is, which is a poem of loss, a song of lamentation. And these last few years, it's felt like we've been living in this moment of collective suspended elegy. So I thought I would read this poem. This is from my grandmother, my mother's mother. And I think that, I think she and Rufus Porter had some things in common. She was very interested in science. She went back to school after she raised her 3 children and got a doctorate in the history of medicine and wrote a book about the early genetics research that led to a theory of DNA. And she was also an artist and particularly loved to do medical illustration. So anyway, this is a poem for her. Elegy for my grandmother in the form of a cactus. The way each linked lobe of your cactus swallows all the green from the one before it reminds me of that movie about the human centipede and how appalled you have been to know such a film exists. Though you are no stranger to the macabre, you who used to warn me not to drink tea too much or my stomach would swell red, you said, citing the story of that man with the shotgun wound in his abdomen, how he became a medical curiosity for the dark, deep hole in him through which the world could suddenly view the innermost sanctum of a human body, which was a long way you had of saying it matters what we put inside ourselves. I have put so many things inside myself I should not have. Smoke of all sorts, whiskey, sorrow, pennies, bottomless guilt, river stones, a crusty work glove pulled off with my teeth. I even licked a Burmese python once. I list the contraband of my body to myself as I eat nachos or frozen French fries off your blue dinner plates, counting the indulgences I imagine you would not have approved. And here I am now, inserting a gross horror movie reference into a poem about your absence, a poem I began writing only because I wanted you to know. Your cactus is flowering again, as it has for 4 years now, fuchsia flames licking out from the maw of each final green, I don't know what to call it, not a leaf, but a section of stem pressed flat until Yes, it erupts into firework, a tongue or tail of brightness uncurling into this winter room. I wanted you to know. It flowered the night you died. It flowered because I told it to you in your hospital bed and me not there. And now I force it unconsciously each year. Forget to water for months, then soak it with the thawed remains of yesterday's chicken pail. It's an Easter cactus, really. I wanted you to know. I looked it up on a diagram today. The 3 shapes of lobe, but yours is willful, peculiar, blooms only in late January, blooms only for you, which is fitting since we don't believe in resurrection, you or I. Just another flattened green segment each year, another stubborn explosion of beauty at the end of our grief. So I guess this next poem is an elegy of sorts too, but not a personal elegy. This one's more of an elegy for the earth. What you need to know for this poem is the term endling, which means the last animal, surviving animal of its species. And the other thing I guess I can tell you about this poem is that the form of this poem, it's written as an abecedarian, which means that each stanza here in this poem, it's written in either single lines or couplets, and each of these begins with the letter of the alphabet in order, so A, B, C. A catalog of endlings. Aurochs in 1627, in what's now Poland, their pre-bovine bodies found in a forest not far from Kingfield, where my own ancestors might be. Benjamin in 1936, the last Tasmanian tiger of neglect, pacing her cage at Hobart Zoo. And don't forget Booming Ben, solitary heath hen. Celia, the Pyrenean ibex. They tried to clone her back from extinction, and for 7 minutes she was not the last, but her clone couldn't breathe. Dusky seaside sparrow, the one called Orange Band, held captive at Discovery Island, Disney World. Every extant being, each of us, eventually extinct. Fatu, daughter of Najin, last of the northern white rhinoceros. Golden toad, last seen in 1989. George, the Oahu tree snail. Hurricane Dorian took the last Bahama nuthatches, or so they suspect. I have no children, nor does my sister. Thus ends our branch of the family tree. I offer my mother no shelter from this grief. Julia, the bald ibis, shot down mid-migration. Kwai'o'o, last seen in 1985, last heard in 87. Lonesome George, the Pinta Island tortoise, lived to 102. At the end, magazines called him the rarest creature in the world. Martha, last passenger pigeon, was named for Martha Washington. Strange joke of history. Her remains now housed in a steel Smithsonian storage locker. Nobody knew or cared when the endlings died, writes Eric Friedman, who coined the term. It is deep to the bone chilling to know the exact date a species disappeared. Organs are removed in taxidermy. Martha's live in a jar of embalming fluid, the rest of her wired to branch and styrofoam beside a male she never knew. Pooly birds gone too, none seen in nearly 20 years. Quagga dead 250 years, killed for meat and skins. Rufous-fronted laughing thrush, just one left now in Java. Surviving specimen, last of its species, how simple it is to just disappear. Sentimentality won't save any of us in the end. Tarpon in 1909 in captivity, Tuffy the rab's fringe-limbed tree frog, Turgey the last Polynesian tree snail. Unnoticed mostly, various causes. Women's hats wanted bright tail feathers. It was that plus deforestation that took the Carolina parakeet. X is the loudest letter in extinction. X marks the spot. It is even more ghastly to look upon the place where it happened and know. Yangtze giant soft-shelled turtles are down to only 3. Zoo plaque, museum box, the lucky ones. Most gone before we name them, are caring only born to shape in absence. So I have 2 more I'd like to read you. This poem was inspired by watching a YouTube video that came out in February 2020 of a British hospital did a surgery on a professional violinist, a brain surgery. She had a tumor that they needed to remove, and they wanted to make sure that she would still be able to play the violin afterward. So they had her awake during the surgery playing the violin, and they could tell, if they got too close to the part of her brain, because her playing would change. And it's an incredible video to watch. So I watched it a whole bunch of times and I wrote this poem. What will you do at the end of the world? When I watch the video where the violinist plays as surgeons cut the cancer from her brain, my first impulse is to descend into metaphor, to imagine the plaintive cry of her violin as a singular silvery thread that leads the surgeons sublimely, tremulously through the Minotaur's maze, so they can extract the tumor abutting the lobe that controls her left hand, so they can navigate the fleshy labyrinthine folds and electric shocks that make a human mind. When I watch her bow graze the ventilator tube again and again, I want to recall the old story of Nero playing as Rome burned, which is supposed to be a story about callous cruelty and ineffectual leadership, but which fails to hold up under historic scrutiny for many reasons, including that the violin was not invented until the 11th century. Still, the fable lends him more humanity than not. The notion that there was music inside him, even if it took 6 days of burning to fan it out. A music so powerful it forced itself to escape his tyrant's mouth. If art is only pleasure, Nero's act is selfish, loathsome, but if art is survival, a violin siren might morph to beacon against the smoky air. Keep asking my poems what the world needs from me in these days of quickening dread, of burgeoning conflagration, what they want me to do. In the comments section below the hospital video, no one can agree on what they're seeing. Creepy, incredible, horrifying, beautiful. Afterward, the violinist recalls, I kept thinking, get out of my way. I need to play louder. Ooh. Thank you all so much for bearing with me. I'm going to read one last poem to close out, and then we can do some Q&A. This is the other poem that I've written as a public poem as during my time as Poet Laureate so far. And this is the poem that I wrote for the governor's inauguration this past January and delivered there, which was definitely the scariest public reading I've ever done of my life. But I wanted to read this today because I had a reading on Saturday, and my friend who's was my neighbor up in the woods for many years. Told me she wished I'd read this poem because we've been sugaring together and we've been carrying a lot of buckets. So even though she's not at this reading today, I'm making up for it by reading this poem now. This home we carry. What if home begins as simply as a bucket, with light flaming the trees toward morning and a familiar rocking weight, home swinging at our side as we go about the chores. Home knocks our leg into the rhythm of our footsteps, lulling, bruising us to a terrain we have already memorized, cartography we now know without knowing, like the curve of a lover's temple, how it fits flush to our palm, each rut in the woods trail, each concrete crack in the sidewalk, every expanse of field or lake below snow, granite screeing mountain crests, granite spurring the coastline to chains of cliff and island, our strength indistinguishable from our beauty rooted to our hardness, rooted to this glacial till and soil beneath our feet. Chop wood, they tell us, when times are hard, carry water, and so we do. And some days it seems we do nothing but carry, have been carrying such a long time. And the bucket in our hands is plastic, probably, reddened knuckles around a cracked grip. Or the bucket is galvanized steel, or the bucket is spun aluminum. But before that, it was wood. And before that, it was animal hide, or it was birch bark, or it was not a bucket at all, but a basket. Woven strips of the brown ash tree, or the reed, a shindy, its earthy scent carried across the Atlantic from Somalia to weave again a new carrying. Home held in the knowledge of hands teaching new hands. For in this vessel we carry cinders, ashes, which are the spent remains of yesterday's fire, but also the memory of its warmth. And in this bucket are the words of our ancestors, the stories of our ancestors told us in their languages, which maybe we never learned to speak, though we carry the recollection in this bucket, along with the harms done to or by them, carry it inside the silences we did learn, carry it with dirt and rocks, with manure, wood chips, sawdust, rivets and welding rods, with a ship's manifest or a changed name, a broken treaty, mulch or wilting root-ripped weeds, carry with grain for the chickens, with grain for the pigs, with salted herring to bait the lobster traps, carry with all the ghosts and bones of our history, with the maps history has made of our ghosts and our bones, carry in this bucket with the sweet scent of frost-burned apples, with the clear cold sugar the maple trees bleed in the spring, with the water of the Penobscot, the St. John, the Kennebec, the Androscoggin, with peonies cut and glistening nectar, their heavy blossoms, both home and food for the ants, carry, along with some root vegetable we have dug fresh from the earth, planted and tended with our own two hands. Potatoes or carrots, perhaps, or the forage green pungency of ramps or fiddleheads. Some gift we are carrying now up this steep hill or along the street as a promise to our children or their children, carrying to eat or to store through another winter, carrying separately, each of us, but all at the same time, carrying still across each new day until our carrying becomes a chorus, a linking, a lifting, a gathering. This offering we share with those we love, our arms outstretched to one another as we say, "Here, I have brought you a taste of our home." Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Julia.
Taking
I,
a look. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I really enjoyed how much I connected with that in terms of just living in Maine and knowing that we're both from away. And I consider myself a homesteader too. So your story of the weasel really hit home and all the buckets and all the sapping. So if we have any questions, the chat is open. Please.
I am looking at Betty Cully's question right now.
Okay, you can see that. Okay.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I couldn't, but now I'm looking. So I wonder, yeah, I might have answered this in the process of continuing the reading, Patty. I don't know, but you're right. I loved your first new poem and wondered how you feel about your own land. Does your land have a history? And are you writing more poems about that theme? I am, yes. And I don't know if you asked this question before I read the poem about after we wound the land to maps, because I think that was a poem that very much is the history of my land. And I wanted to sort of reckon with some of that, how I fit into that. But absolutely, I think that's going to be a recurring theme for me, very much so. So how does one become the poet laureate? Well, I found this out, maybe a little by accident, but there was basically a call for applications for the poet laureate. So the term for the Maine Poet Laureate is 5 years. I'm the 6th Maine Poet Laureate. Our last poet laureate was Stuart Kestenbaum, and he held the position from 2016 to 2021. And in 2021, there was a committee that was formed by the Maine Arts Commission, and it included, actually the governor was on the committee, and then Samad Dirakib, who is the head of the Maine Humanities Council, Gibson Fay LeBlanc, who's with Maine Writers and Publishers, the head of Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance. I'm going to forget everyone that's on the committee, but there's about 5 or 6 people on the committee. And I was encouraged by someone in my town to send an application. It was not on my radar to do this. I just assumed I was at least 20 years too young. So I wasn't paying much attention to this. And then I was encouraged to do it. So I thought, okay, why not? It'll be good practice for in 20 years when I'm ready to do this. But I guess that's not quite the way it shook out. So it's very exciting to get to do this at this point in my life. And I've been learning so much. I feel like there was so much natural folklore in your writing. What was the history? Was the history of your land made up or factual? There's some of both, right? And I think this is something that I encountered with Midden too. You know, there's fact and there's story, and they get very, very wound together sometimes. In ways that are really confusing and hard to parse. A lot of what I wrote in the poem that outlines the history of my land is factual, but I don't know if all of it is. I mean, they're all stories I've been told, but I don't know if they're all true. The one about the farmer cursing at, shaking his fist at the sky, and then his barn getting struck by lightning was told to me. And it's an amazing story, but I cannot confirm it. I can confirm that the previous owner was arrested by the DA with helicopters, and that those holes are still in the front yard. That I can confirm. So a lot of it, but to some extent, right, the stories become part of it too, even if they're not actually true, right? Or they become it, so I one of the things I thought about when I was writing Midden is that there was so much I would never know. And generally I'd always thought of research. I come from on my father's side, my grandfather was a historian. And so I think of, when you think of history and you think of research, I think of demonstrating what I know. But when I was writing Midden, I realized that there was so much I didn't know. And the fact that I didn't know it and why I didn't know it mattered perhaps more than what I did know. So I carry some of that thinking with me, I think, into thinking about other histories as well. Okay, let's see, what else am I? Are there particular poets or writers who have influenced your work or approach to poetry? Yes, but this is the hardest question to answer because it's always changing for me so much, depending on what I'm working on. You know, I have a long list of poets and books that I read in the back of Midden that were influential to me in writing that book. But I can just, you know, I can try to just name some names. You know, and also, of course, poets I've worked with who've been incredibly influential for me as well. But Joy Harjo, our former poet laureate, is one. My friend Rebecca Gale Howell, who's written an incredibly beautiful book called Render an Apocalypse, that's about pig farming. That's just gorgeous. Patricia Smith, a huge influence, especially when I was writing Midden. In the, you know, newer poems, Rick Barrow has been a huge influence for me. Also, I'm trying to think, Erica Meitner, these long sort of weaving poems that I've been working on, you know, she's helped me think about those a little bit, and even letting a little bit of humor slide into my poems, which is a new thing for me. You know, it's just a constantly changing list. So, and also I would be remiss if I didn't mention Edna St. Vincent Millay as a Maine poet. I'm actually, a project I'm working on now is I've started writing these epistolary poems addressed to Edna St. Vincent Millay. It turns out, so I live on Millay Hill, in New Portland. And it turns out there's a small cemetery on my property. And it turns out, I didn't know this when we got the land, but it turns out that Sarah Millay, who she and her husband, John, first started a farm on this hill, she's buried in the cemetery, and she is the paternal great-grandmother of Edna St. Vincent Millay. So I feel connected to her, you know, in a way through that history. And so I've been writing poems to her most recently.
Anybody else have any questions they want to put in the chat? Don't be shy, Deb. Can't tell if anybody's writing. Oh, something just.
Am I from Maine?
No, I just want to say I did not know what I was getting into tonight, and I enjoyed it tremendously. I thought I might go to sleep, but you have mesmerized me. I loved it. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much. And I had to laugh when you said you didn't know what you were getting into. I didn't have that effect on people. I can be a little more than people have bargained for. So I'm glad that was a good thing for you, because
it was wonderful. Thank you.
The question, am I from Maine? So I'm not originally from Maine. I have lived in, I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. And I've lived in Maine since 2005. But I, you know, and I know that this is contrary to the way Maine thinks about home and relation to place, but I truly believe there's some of us who have to leave home to find home. And Maine, you know, Maine is very much my home. And while I was not born here, I intend to stay here for the rest of my life.
It's been nice catching up with other people from Connecticut, because both Shane and I are from Connecticut, and they had a little discussion about where Rufus Porter might be buried.
Yeah, yeah, in New Haven, yeah, so. It was,
Shane confirmed the cemetery.
that it was the Grove Street Cemetery, yeah.
I didn't know offhand, but that seems to make sense.
I mean, I feel like anybody important who's buried in New Haven, that's where they're buried, probably. At least from that time, so.
Any other questions? Okay, right on time, 8:02. We started at 7:02.
Perfect.
Okay,
Well, thank you all so much.
thank you.
Thank
Julia.
you.
This has been terrific. So I'll be in touch with you soon.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you. Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.